This book is one of the most important books for people who are thinking through the economic paradigm shift that we might be living through. And it's so important, in fact, that I'm planning to do a 4-part series on this book. And this video is really outlining the frame and the way he's approaching this exercise of looking back 5,000 years about how debt and money and the relationship of debt and money to violence and morality has played out across time. Because much like me, he actually thinks that most people's thinking is way too stuck in the 20th century when we're thinking through how economic systems work. So he's saying, no, we need to look back and open our minds to try to figure out what are really different ways of structuring economic stuff. So this is really about getting out of the rut of economic thinking that we've been stuck inside. In which case, where am I going in this video? And I'm going to start out by just giving some quotes from him about his view of this change point moment in history and how massive it could be. And then I want to talk about an opening anecdote he gives at the beginning of the book about a cocktail party conversation he had that got him thinking about the relationship between debt and morality. And of course, the book is titled Debt, Not Money, so I think that anecdote helps frame that. Then I want to talk about the differences between his view and mine. I think that will be helpful going into this series because there are some points where I don't align with him. And then I will outline where I'm going with the series, the different videos. And finally, I just want to give a sense for his sense of hope, which very much I think aligns with my own sense of hope. Now let's start with some quotes. Is this crisis some kind of generational phenomenon or a mere movement of capitalism's boom or bust cycle? Or is it something even grander? The more I puzzled over the question, the more I decided that this was a break on the broadest possible historical scale. And that in order to understand it, we needed to completely rethink our sense of the rhythms of economic history. And then another quote that gives the sense that he views this as a moment of historical opportunity. To begin to free ourselves, the first thing we need to do is see ourselves again as historical actors, as people who can make a difference in the course of world events. And he talks about a false sense of powerlessness that we have that's kind of embedded into the way we think, which I'll get to at the end. But all of this relates to my channel because I'm thinking through paradigm shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. And of course, this is an economic sort of book, and it relates most to that realm, even though, of course, all three of those are interrelated. But let's look at a cocktail party conversation that he opens the book with. And just to give you a little background on this, he was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And this conversation he's talking about relates to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. He's, of course, opposed to the IMF and some of the things it's doing. But the IMF is not, the book is not about the IMF. The IMF is one of these representative, big, powerful actors in the modern age when it comes to deciding whose debt gets forgiven, who has to undergo harsh punishments until they pay their debt, all of that kind of stuff. And let me give you a quote actually that indicates, yes, this is just a representative actor in the modern world for debt. And he's comparing it in this quote to the kings of olden days, the religious institutions of the Middle Ages, which of course is where he's going with this book. He's looking at institutions throughout history that have made these economic determinations about the way resources flow, the way power flows, all of that. Insofar as the overarching grand cosmic institutions have been created that might be considered in any way parallel to the divine kings of the ancient Middle East or the religious authorities of the Middle Ages, they have not been created to protect debtors, but to enforce the rights of creditors. The International Monetary Fund is only the most dramatic case in point here. And in this conversation, he was complaining that the IMF was imposing restrictions and sanctions and forcing countries to retrench, where those countries were having to forgo healthcare and forgo food rations. And really, when you look back at the history of why these countries owed money to the IMF, it was because some unelected dictator a generation ago had borrowed money for their own power, and the people, perhaps the country had paid that back multiple times over, but because of accumulating debt and compound interest, the country still owed and still had to ration and all this stuff. And so, of course, he was complaining about this in this cocktail party conversation. And his partner in the cocktail party conversation said, "Surely one must pay one's debts." And he realized then that that was a moral statement. It was a statement about the morality, that the country had to sort of prioritize the morality of paying back the debt over the morality of, serving their population that really needed things. Or at least that's sort of the overarching moral frame. And of course, that means he's going back and he's going to look at what are the moral frames that have shaped who gets money in the long run. And another thing going on here is that it's not actually true that everyone must always pay their debts. Businesses go bankrupt all the time, and you sort of write that out. The job of banking is weighing risk, like the risk that a business or a country or a person will not pay something back with the interest rate. That's sort of expected that some of these loans will not be repaid. That's involved with the risk. And so the question of who has to repay their debts and who can just file for bankruptcy and, let it ride and let that go, those decisions are going to deeply influence how resources flow, how scarce resources flow in an economy. And the moral frame of the whole economic system is going to have to prioritize whose debts have to be harshly enforced, whose debts are let go. So the book is really going back throughout history and seeing how have these expectations, these moral expectations and the way risk and debt and money is managed, how has that changed? What are the different structures over time? And I definitely agree with this frame. The way I would define an economic system is that it's a set of institutions that determine where scarce resources flow. And what is an institution? An institution is a set of rules, roles, norms, and enforcement mechanisms that structure human relationships. So, of course, if we're thinking about norms and enforcement mechanisms, morality is one of the biggest factors at play. The norms around what people consider legitimate and illegitimate and worthy of social scorn, worthy of social accolades, all of that is wrapped up in morality. So I think it's absolutely important and key that he's looking at sort of the moral enforcement mechanisms throughout history. That's part of institutions. And of course, scarce resources flow. Scarce resources include things like food and housing and energy, like oil. It includes labor, but it also includes things like human attention and some other types of scarce resources I think we're going to have to get creative with as we're thinking about which scarce resources matter. And in a lot of ways, this is really about how we prioritize our obligations to people. What obligations need to take top priority, what obligations can go to the wayside if need be, given that resources are scarce and not everything can be materialized. So that's the frame here. Given that I'm doing a series on this, I think it's helpful for me to lay out up front the differences between my own thinking and his. And the first of these relates to the myth of barter. He has a whole chapter early on the myth of barter. And it's like I partially agree and partially don't. He views this as two types of myth. I view it as one type of myth. Now, I think he does an amazing job of going through history and showing historically how did systems work in these small villages that we have in our heads when we're thinking through how economics works. Actually, direct barter, where I'm trading a shoe for your iron pot, that kind of barter did not take place very often throughout history. So that's an amazing contribution. But when he characterizes how economists think about the myth of barter, that was not at all the way I think of it. And there's actually a lot of other times in the book where he characterizes the way economists think. And I'm like, that is not how I think. And I think that's not the way the most mature economists think. Now, I'm actually going to do a whole video on, are economists the villains? And the answer is yes and no. It's both of those. And I think people who think like him have an intuition about the role of economists in the current economy, where that intuition is correct. But then there's a follow-up to that that mischaracterizes how economists think. And if the task is we have to think through new economic structures, having these straw man mythologies about how economists think, I think that's actually going to get in the way of the whole endeavor. So that will be a video. That's actually two videos that I plan to do. I'm going to do the one on the myth of barter. I'd like to explore economic myths more generally and other thinkers who are thinking about how do we, what are the falsehoods that we believe? What roles do those play? And when are those helpful? When are those harmful? That kind of thing. A second difference between his thinking and mine relates to the time scale he's envisioning for this change. This is definitely a moment of transition. No one is going to be able to have any chance of saying what all this really means for another generation at the very least. That's how he's envisioning this change point moment. But I actually think it could happen faster than that. Given the technology, given artificial intelligence and digital tools, I do think some of these changes, including changes in the moral frame, are actually happening way more quickly than they have in the past. So, of course, when we look historically, like as far as he's been looking, yes, it takes hundreds of years, or at least 100 years, for some of these changes to slowly morph into the structure of the economy. But in the current age, change is sped up. So I think we should think of this as something that could happen over a much shorter time period, like a 10-year or 20-year time period. And the third disagreement I have with him relates to the notion of throwing out ideas or concepts. And in this quote, he's going to use the word jettisoning, and I had to look that word up. It's basically throwing something overboard out of a ship so that it's gone. You're no longer carrying that in the ship. And here's the quote. "One thing that's clear is that such new ideas cannot emerge without jettisoning much of our accustomed categories of thought, which have become mostly sheer dead weight, if not intrinsic parts of the very apparatus of hopelessness, and formulating new ones." On one hand, I do agree that there will have to be some ideas that will ultimately be thrown overboard or jettisoned. What I disagree with is the notion that we can actually figure those out from the standpoint of today. It's like we don't know which of these ideas are dead weight. We don't know which of these ideas will actually be really important and foundational in a system that we cannot yet imagine. Now, where am I going in this series? And I'm not going to promise a specific number of videos, mainly because I don't really know where my imagination is going to take me as I prepare them. But there's going to be some questions that I want to look at and explore through the series. How did morality and violence underpin different economic structures of the past? That's definitely a theme throughout his book, and I want to relate it to my institutional economics frame for what an economic system is, and just think about how that worked throughout history. And then if he's saying we are in the middle of a centuries-long economic shift, The obvious question is, what did those economic shifts look like when people were going through major shifts of the past? And of course, he divides history into the axial age, the Middle Ages, the age of capitalism, and the current era. So we want to know, in between these ages, what was going on to create this major shift? And how did that relate to religion and morality? The one he fleshes out the most is really the axial age, transition to axial age to the Middle Ages. And of course, that was when the world's major religions popped up. And he's saying that actually those religions were responding morally to the economic situation they found themselves in. And that was actually what drove the rise of these religions, or certainly one factor that was playing a role in their rise. So what's going on with that? And then, of course, I want to explore his notion of the myth of barter and economists' view on the myth of barter, my disagreement with him there. And then I want to explore his notion of communism. And he defines communism as to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities. So how did that operationalize in past economies? How does that relate, if at all, to the totalitarian governments that essentially used communism as a justification for what they were doing? And then what can we learn about these gift economies, these economies that had mutuality underpinning them? He goes into a lot of the juicy details in that type of small village, oftentimes economic system. So those are the questions I want to explore through the series. Now, finally, I want to give you a sense for how he's thinking about hope, because it relates to what he calls the apparatus of hopelessness. And okay, that sounds like opposites. Like, how could the apparatus of hopelessness be the source of hope? But the thing is, we have these ways of thinking and ways of reacting to certain ideas and concepts that do sort of enforce hopelessness, where when we encounter new ideas about the future, there are certain reactions that I have to those things and other people have that sort of give us a sense that it's always going to be like this. Like, the system is not going to change for the better, or that we have no agency over the way the system changes and evolves. And in a lot of ways, overcoming that apparatus of hopelessness is the task. Let me give you a quote here. It could well be said that the last 30 years have seen the construction of a vast bureaucratic apparatus for the creation and maintenance of hopelessness. A giant machine designed first and foremost to destroy any sense of possible alternative futures. To do so requires propaganda engines of every conceivable variety, most of which do not attack alternatives directly so much as create a pervasive climate of fear, jingoistic conformity, and simple despair that renders any thought of changing the world seem an idle fantasy. Even if we are at the beginning of the turn of a very long historical cycle, it is still largely up to us to determine how it is going to turn out. For instance, the last time we shifted from a bullion economy to one of virtual credit money at the end of the axial age and the beginning of the Middle Ages, the immediate shift was experienced largely as a series of catastrophes. Will it be the same this time around? Presumably, a lot depends on how consciously we set out to ensure that it won't be. So he's really trying to convey a sense of agency, and that, I think, is what I appreciate the most.